You know what, this is the last session of the day, and I know we have all been going since very early today, and some of us had very late evenings, and yesterday was a big day as well for a lot of us. So, and this is, I mean, it actually really depends. It used to be a joke, but like carbon accounting, sexy, it's hot, it's really, really important. And so we are going to maximize our time together, and I do really want to make this kind of interactive. So if there are, even over the course of kind of the interventions, the presentations, and you have a question of clarification or a quick comment, then feel free to put up your hand and let's kind of see how we roll. And then obviously we will have more of a kind of proper intentional segment for Q&A from the audience. And the acoustics here, I probably don't even need a mic, but like they're pretty good. So let's do this. I'm Katie Sullivan. I know many people in these rooms. I am the managing director of the International Emissions Trading Association, and I have had the pleasure of working with CAR for a number of years, and I've had the pleasure of working with these three guys, for a long time as well. And this session did not even sprout up until a couple of weeks ago when CAR I don't even recall exactly what happened. It was like, well, is there a proper carbon accounting and disclosure segment? And it was like, nope. It's like, well, let's do this. And I know Guy and Chris and Aaron, they'll be floating around. So let's bring them on stage and let's pick their brains and see where they agree and maybe don't agree on where things are, where things importantly should head on this front. So Guy Turner, managing director, now advisor, MSCI. And then we have Chris Davis, Senior Fellow, Climate Policy and Markets Initiative and Task Force for Climate Action Transparency at TCAT. He wears many other hats. I'm going to let them each introduce themselves a little more properly in a sec. And then Aaron Kay, Program Manager, GHG Accounting and Strategic Applications at EPRI. So why don't actually we just do a quick round, not the whole bio, but just your perspective, like where your current affiliation and your interest just in this topic and why it's important 2026, 2027.
Yes, so, well, if I put my MSCI hat on and do my sort of representation of them, for those who don't know, MSCI is the largest provider of sustainability and climate data to financial markets in the world. Over $1 trillion of capital tracks the sustainability and climate indexes that we produce. You want to buy a low carbon ETF or a sustainable ETF, it probably will use MSCI data. A lot of that data is based on carbon emissions. Sorry, not all of it, but the sort of the environmental side of it. So we do it for 10,000 of the world's largest companies. We use the information that is reported to them. We then analyze it, clean it, do various things to it, and then provide that to the financial markets. These numbers move capital, significant volumes of capital. We get those numbers wrong, and that capital ends up in the wrong places. So this is serious beans to get these numbers right. Companies that are genuinely making improvements on climate or claim to be need to prove that they are having that climate benefit, be it, and that's where the accounting comes in. So we're the end point of all of this accounting, all of these accounting machinations. So yeah, these numbers have consequences.
And how many companies, just quickly, are disclosing scopes 1 and 2 public? Largest.
I don't know, because if they don't disclose it, we calculate it for them. But it's in the tens of thousands.
Okay, Chris?
Thanks, Katie. Chris Davis, as Katie said, I'm a senior fellow at the High Tide Foundation. We involved in a number of different initiatives, all generally aimed at trying to help the voluntary carbon market and develop and evolve and mature, but also spend a lot of time within the context of that, working with companies to try to overarchingly encourage more corporate voluntary investment in climate action, whatever that might look like. Katie and I got to know each other. I was the climate and energy policy advisor for the governor in our state of Washington, so I spent a lot of time thinking about carbon market design within sort of the public sector. And then I moved over and spent 4 years at Amazon, where I ran a sustainability public policy team, which, among other things, kind of led me into getting involved in GHG accounting. I never meant for this to happen, but as Guy describes, it became very clear to me in a company as sort of sprawling as Amazon, with a value chain kind of distributed all over the world. The company was never, and it is never, going to make its climate targets without the use of market instruments. There's simply no way at getting it. Sort of value and supply chain is widely distributed and complex as Amazon's, with if sort of direct engagement in all of your particular suppliers is kind of the precursor to being able to show progress on your inventory. And so that led me down the road of sort of understanding, how the various guidance bodies and standards that were available to a company like Amazon directed us both to pick and choose mitigation actions, but then quantify and report that in a credible way. And that was really, that really emerged as a sort of overarching barrier to a company like Amazon being able to deploy the sort of capital that it has available to it for decarbonization, because the risk of getting that wrong and then eventually making claims that would be disputed was, sort of too great. And so it created a great stall for us. I started to kind of look around for other folks in other companies who were sort of grappling with similar situations, and found quite a large peer group of my counterparts in companies who at that moment we're really facing the same things. And I tend to think of this as actually an outgrowth of good news, right? The reason in part that we are sitting here and have been grappling with this accounting problem for the last couple of years is in part because concurrent with that time, companies have had a widely and quickly sort of expanding range of avenues to make decarbonization process, whether that's investing in green steel or green concrete or renewable diesel, or sort of choose your decarbonization technology and put it in. And while there has been a proliferation of those kinds of technologies for across different hard-to-abate commodities or different manufacturing processes, the standards bodies have simply not kept up with being clear about how companies who then choose to make those investments should quantify and report those things. And so the Task Force for Corporate Action Transparency came together as a collection of companies and NGOs who recognized this problem and feared that the incumbent standards were not moving fast enough to basically address some of these kind of emerging opportunities. And we originally came together, it's about 30 or so companies and 10 or 12 of the larger ENGOs around the world who focus on corporate action and climate, originally came together to develop guidance language that we could feed into the consultations that we knew to be starting to be undertaken by SBTI, GHGP, and others. Along the way, we realized the importance of that guidance being assurable, being fully utilizable by companies, and so we evolved it into a sort of standalone guidance that was released in September this last year. And I can share a little bit more about the details as we go forward about what's in it, but we are today continuing to feed that guidance into some of the ongoing consultations that remain underway, while also continuing to develop it as a standalone body of accounting and reporting guidance that companies can use to track and report and hopefully ultimately make claims on this wide range of market-based tools.
Thank you, Chris. Yes, so good context, and we will come back to talk about TCAT and some of the kind of near and maybe longer-term activities and vision you see. And Aaron, I actually, that's my fault. We kind of like launched right into it. But I think it is important to for the audience to understand just EPRI, and you are the only one who actually has, program manager, carbon accounting, right, and strategy in their title, and have been kind of living and breathing it for quite a while. Again, share context on EPRI as well, right? We've been, at least EPRI on IETA, long time, associate member of IETA. You also, though, have offered to provide a bit of, as my father says, know your history on emissions reporting and accounting, and a slide as well. So you can introduce yourself, and then when you say go, I'll put up the slide.
That sounds good. Thanks for having me, Katie. I'm excited to be up here. I feel like the emissions accountants really just don't get enough airtime these days. But I think are a few of us who have been sitting in this space for longer than kind of the past 3 or 4 years. But I have to say I'm grateful that it got sexy, right? Like that this is now something that makes news is very cool to me, especially as someone who's very interested in accuracy, transparency, integrity, and a lot of the things that we talk about at NACW, and I'm sure you guys think about in your worlds. Some of the questions actually that Katie just asked me are questions I've been getting for the past couple days, which is why does EPRI care about this? So EPRI originally was the Electric Power Research Institute. Our goal is to maintain the electric grid, but not necessarily in the short term, but help folks think about the next 10, 20, 30, 40 years. So as you guys read the news and see things like fusion energy, SMRs, transmission line congestion, the fun stuff that's coming up in your headlines, a lot of that is the work that we do at the Institute at large. I live in the climate team, and we have the privilege of thinking about not only corporate emissions accounting, so that is the operational accounting that some of y'all do, some of what we're going to talk about, but we have a pretty robust modeling team that does capacity expansion modeling, and why all of you are looking at me confused is because that's a really niche thing generally for the energy sector, but where it comes into consideration in these conversations is in things that are going to come up called consequential accounting. And so for those of you who have been following the conversation on emissions accounting at large, you'll notice that there's robust debate about how to do this in an accurate way. And why does it matter? Because what you can't measure, you can't manage. And what we're trying to do here is we're trying to make sure that there is integrity across the system. Because we end up in a weird spot if 4 different companies are accounting the same emissions. We end up in a weird spot if someone else is making investments into something that they can't quantify, right? Like that impacts deployment of capital, that impacts other customers of things like electricity, that impacts our atmosphere at large. So my interest in this is accuracy, integrity, transparency. But of course, that comes on the backing of the Institute, which is focused on the energy sector. So my very niche expertise is electricity and emissions accounting for electricity. But of course, that's become very fun as we talk about scope 2 for everybody else. So that is kind of me and why I care.
And it's not just the US, right? You're
Oh,
global.
yes, we're global. And I can go into that more if you guys want to talk about specific niche use cases like hourly or sub-hourly tracking in Taiwan. But for now, I think, that covers us.
Now, know your history.
Now know your history, and I have to say this is the part that gets fun. I was originally an international studies major in undergrad, so knowing your history is really important to me, also because we are living a repeat of it right now. And so that frames the conversation that we're having, at least as we talk about U.S. accounting. So within this conversation, you're going to hear a lot of words thrown around. And what I want to do is I want to level set, recognizing that many of you don't come from the world that we come from. So some of the things you're going to hear, and you hear in this conference at large, and I'm sure in your daily lives, is on project level accounting. So that oftentimes is looking at the change in greenhouse gas emissions caused by a specific GHG mitigation or intervention. That's your offset. If you have been following the AIM platform or insetting, that is also your investment into your supply shed, which is your intervention credit mechanism. Their branding. We'll see how it comes out. But that's generally their direction of travel. And then facility level accounting is looking at a specific facility. So if you're Nucor, you're looking at your steel site. If you're a power company, you're looking at your power plant. That is facility level accounting. And then we have entity level accounting, which is what the greenhouse gas protocol generally does, or at least the corporate standard, the scope 2 standard, and then the scope 3 value chain standard. So that is tracking the absolute emissions of a specific entity over a year. And we're going to get into a debate on this, I think, in a second, because part of that is operational accounting, which means that it is what is happening when the facility is running. So for example, a coal power plant, when it generates the megawatt hour of power, it is the emissions from that generation. It is not going all the way down the supply chain. And that brings up the question of then renewables, nuclear, and other forms of carbon-free generation having a 0 metric ton emission factor. And that is a debate or a conversation happening right now. So now here's the know your history moment. For those of you who've been around this table for a long time, these dates are in your life. And I see that some of you are smiling, so you may or may not have remembered this, supported one or more of these efforts. But going back to the original corporate greenhouse gas emissions accounting standard, those started to get developed in the late 90s. They weren't published until 2001. But then what we saw was not only the greenhouse gas protocol developed by WRI, WBCSD, but we also saw the climate registry developing out the general reporting protocol. That then came with subsequent protocols in the same way that the greenhouse gas corporate standard did, except you saw them take a different track. One went scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. One went sector-specific protocols, right? And so in a lot of ways, those are complementary because they look at the same structure or archetype, but then say, okay, if you are in steel manufacturing, you'll think about these things differently, which is true, right? Because different infrastructure takes on different emission factors. And then we got to the point where where a lot of companies said, oh, we should regulate this. This is a good thing. And some of you are going to start to laugh soon because this is the reason we're here. So this is a good thing that we should do, and it should be a federal standard to have this regulated. That federal standard was Waxman-Markey. That passed the House in 2008 and failed in the Senate in 2009. Partially,
How many people were around Waxman-Markey days?
or maybe it's 2009, 2010. My bad.
That's still,
Okay.
It was a long time ago.
Yeah, but it wasn't that long ago, right? Like, it's long enough that it's in our collective memory, which I think is important, partially because a lot of those companies are the same companies that are funding the folks to get this standardized now. Because regulation is bad, it's going to show that we have high pollution, that we have a lot of pollution, it's going to blah, 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 and then that fails. And then there's a free-for-all. And there's different people accounting for things in different ways, and I'm looking at your apples against his pork chops, and I just can't reconcile those two things. So how am I going to invest money? Those numbers move markets, as you heard. So if we can't reconcile those numbers across companies, even within the same industry, how does that make any sense? And then we're layering on things like consequential accounting, investment into infrastructure that are happening within the company itself, and then start happening down their supply chain. Or again, if you're interested in the AIM platform, within a supply shed. And that then further complicates it. And then we're seeing innovative technologies that start temporally shifting emissions, and we're asking, how does that make any sense? You're just a battery. But how do I think about it, right? And that then also changes the way these structures happen. And so now we're back at the original question that was asked in 2008, 2009, again, know your history, where we're saying it's a mess that it's not regulated. It's such a bummer. I wish we had that standardization. I wish that everyone was doing this the same way, or at least within the same sectors the same way. And that was the conversation happening then. And that didn't happen. So now a question for me, right, personally, as someone who's ideologically interested in this, is what makes now different? What makes now better? Are we better positioned to do something like the AMI now? Or is it just that we have now learned a lot? We've seen the problem with doing it in this hodgepodge kind of way. And we see an opportunity or several opportunities to change the way we think about corporate accounting. And again, all of that is the idea, going back to what these guys said, right? All that's the idea that this matters because it moves money. And if you're me, it matters because you want to solve climate change. But for most people, it matters because it moves money, and I'm okay with that outcome as long as that outcome delivers certain results, which I think also is why some people are here. So that's my history spiel.
Thank you, Erin. Okay. So I want to, okay, sorry, I'm going to canvas again. Like I said, this is going to be interactive. How many of you were at Sarah Week last week?
So Jeff doesn't sleep. Anybody else?
So there were lots of things in the headlines. This wasn't as much one of them, but you did have carbon accounting and a lot of discussions that both Jeff and I were involved with. But carbon accounting is big. So let's just say 2026, 2027, you did a great job. Again, know the history, but it's like, at least for IETA, there are some big things that have been decided or will be decided soon. You had touched on the greenhouse gas protocol. You know, it is undergoing major reform right now, scope 2 and soon to be scope 3. And Chris can speak more to the AMI, the Actions and Markets Instrument. draft that's now out for consultation. Importantly, not just necessarily a voluntary world anymore. It's now governments are baking it in or referencing into mandatory programs. So that's a big deal. Also, the carbon border adjustment mechanism, right? So that is another thing that is no longer academic exercise. It is become real with a definitive period, and it is all about product level or embedded carbon, right, at the product level, and transparency, actual data. So there are some things, right, that have happened to make this era a bit different, and it is on the minds of many, many businesses, including some who maybe were at CERAWeek and are not at NACW. Okay, so I think maybe actually, Chris, teeing you up just related to, and like being tactical a bit as well. So with TCAT, and you can explain a bit more about TCAT, but around the greenhouse gas protocol reforms that are underway, why they are so important and everybody should be paying attention or rallying their troops to start paying attention and get engaged. And this AMI document that just dropped yesterday.
Go. Let's see. So I think you've heard a couple, I think, attempts, good attempts to try to sort of, answer the why is this important? Why are we thinking about this and spending this much time question. And just a few more thoughts on that. Number one, we start within TCAT in particular, but I think for everyone up here on this panel, we start with the idea that demonstrating action, climate action, legitimately by corporates remains a really important thing to do, right? That despite the kind of political headwinds that we have, particularly in the United States today, we still, and I think we hear this consistently from the many companies that we work with, it still remains really important. It remains important for social license to operate in areas. It remains important for tax liability issues. It remains important in a business-to-business context when you are looking to show companies that you are bidding for work on, that you can deliver them demonstrably lower carbon services and products in a business-to-business context. There's a whole range of different reasons why this remains important, in addition to just sort of the big climate outcomes that we've all put words to today and are motivated by. At the same time, it also remains true that most of the activities that companies can take on these fronts remains out of the money. Most of these low carbon or decarbonizing type of investments in capital operations and manufacturing processes, in your fleets, in your energy sources, in the nature of the products that you put into your own manufacturing processes are more expensive than the conventional alternatives. Which means if you're one of the people inside these companies making the case for companies to take on these costs, which they fundamentally are not obligated to do in most cases, unless we're talking about compliance environments, you have an uphill battle. And what we have contended with, what folks in that position have contended with for the last couple of years, is a body of guidance that then tells you once you've made those investments and you attempt to quantify them and account them and report them, whether that's internally or to your assurance providers or to the public or to your investors, that there is great risk in doing that because there's inconsistencies, as you've heard, in how to do the math. There's been lack of clarity of, unlike we have sort of in the financial reporting world about what best practices for recording these are. There's great uncertainty about the legal status of these investments, the instruments themselves, and how they should be treated for tax purposes or for inclusion on your financial reports. All of that uncertainty simply adds to the headwinds that companies have or individuals have when they're making the case to make these investments to begin with. And so these are kind of the motivating reasons why I think this becomes important to solve, because it's an unlock that basically opens up offers the opportunity to open up what is otherwise still quite difficult business cases for making these kinds of actions when they're economically still not advantageous. What we're seeing, and part of what has motivated in sort of the structure that we've taken, is that there is a sort of, you're sort of hearing pieces of this already. There is a sort of dominant theme in the existing guidance that we have that companies are taking action should see that action reflected in their physical inventories. If you're a company today and you have a disclosure responsibility under a government program, you are typically reporting your scopes 1, 2, and 3. That is your physical footprint. That is your GHG inventory. our desire and the desire of the guidance, the sort of theory of the change of the guidance, is that when you make an investment in some kind of a mitigation activity, it maps back into that inventory. You can see emissions go down in either scopes 1, 2, or 3. It's the fundamental theory of change about what we're trying to do with our mitigation activities to make it show up in our footprint. The reality is that for many of the largest scale, biggest opportunity investments companies have, they are in things that are never going to make it back into your inventory. For a whole host of reasons that we can talk about, it doesn't happen. And so the question is, what mitigation are we taking off the table by having an accounting system that insists on everything that's legitimate having to make its way into your inventory? This isn't to say that inventory-based investments are bad. It isn't to say that we shouldn't be incentivizing companies to do it. It does say that if we restrict or require companies to adhere to a system where the only things that are legitimate are and it can be reported towards a target are the things that show up in your inventory, it means we're leaving a lot of important mitigation off the table. So the idea behind what TCAT came forward to do was to basically explore what kinds of changes to target accounting might need to be made so that these outside larger sets of activities could eventually count. That opens up a lot of really tricky questions that we're still working through. What we landed on was that prior to even attacking some of those questions, we could make a lot of progress by simply making initial steps to say, let's just talk about how to organize and quantify and report these activities. At the time we started this process, there wasn't actually guidance that would instruct companies investing in, say, renewable diesel certificates or green concrete or activities to provide your customers access to green power in the form of renewable energy. For companies choosing to do those things, we needed a clear, consistent way to actually record that investment, to document the underlying methodologies that were used to calculate the impacts, to establish sort of the rights to claim the impacts of that investment, and to communicate that consistently from one company to the next or from one scope to the next. That is the fundamental sort of outcome of our first body of guidance that we released this September. It takes the shape of a multiple ledger framework, which is a terminology you'll use. The multiple ledgers simply add basically reporting templates and tools that allow companies to follow a set of rules in the application of they're thinking about a particular mitigation activity so that you report those in consistent boxes, so to speak. Since doing this, we work closely with the AMI process under the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. We work closely with the Green Markets Activation folks and the AIM. These are lots of acronyms and lots of processes that you may or may not be familiar with. But you are beginning to see multiple ledger frameworks now sort of show up in different places because it's a good way to sort of start off by simply like organizing the sock drawer and making sure that everything's kind of organized in the same way and people are thinking about those instruments similarly and as they're reporting. With that done, we can start to have a conversation about what should then count for what kinds of targets. How do we mix and match things that put in this box and that box with an overarching target or a goal that a company has set? What is an appropriate instrument to apply under what conditions, under what timing, and so forth? That's the conversation we're coming into now. That's the conversation that has been teed up by the release yesterday of the AMI working paper, a working paper which is a product of the Greenhouse Gas Protocol's AMI working group, which is kind of a vessel for companies and NGOs to come through and talk about very much these types of issues in the context of the GHGP. Stop there for now.
Did you mention which companies are around the table? It's been about a year and a half, maybe you were stealth for a while, year and a half, 2-year process, just with TCAT, just for context for the audience. What companies are there involved?
Yeah, I mean, we are fortunate to have a cross-section of many of the climate-leading companies that you would imagine who are sort of, blazing trail on doing this kind of work. Many of the high-tech firms themselves, many of the consumer goods companies, Pepsi, McDonald's, General Motors, Meta, Salesforce, Amazon. We also work with EDF, we mean business with Siri, with a variety of number of big NGOs who themselves have programs or individuals with accounting or GHG quantification expertise. And so the technical work that we have put together, we very intentionally and overtly say is practitioner driven. I mean, this is designed and shaped and put out by the folks that basically are grappling with these concerns underneath the hood, and done so with our environmental partners as a means of helping to ensure the kind of overarching integrity and quality of the outcomes.
Thanks, Chris. I know our time's scarce, but I think the audience, it's helpful to know who's involved. So, AMI, deadline, May 31st. To provide input into that document. And so, Guy, the other thing, GHG Protocol Scope 2 has been through a ride. It's been through a ride so far, definitely not done. As Aaron pointed out, like this is where we talk RECs and power, and it is still certainly not done, but it is a bit more, has progressed more than Greenhouse Gas Protocol Scope 3, right? That will be coming down the pike. So, Guy, I'm going to turn it to you first, at least, because I know there will be some other comments related to protocol or GGP Scope 2. But like, what is kind of your thinking and the data and approaches? And I'm open to this being spicy or not, and then also turning it to the question as well. So what are you thinking around GHGP Scope 2?
Well, first of all, I don't have a dog in this fight.
That's good. Fair.
Right. We're a data provider, an analyst. So we'll work with whatever the authorities sort of deem to be most appropriate. But I just have an independent perspective. I've observed the reporting of these emissions over the decades that I've been involved in this industry, and I have always felt that the reporting of Scope 2 emissions to be problematic. That's why we have both location-based and market-based approaches. And, Aaron, your work on this is way more detailed than mine. But what I can see is the significant use of market. For those, does people put your hands up if you know what the difference between location-based and market-based accounting for Scope 2 is? And put your hands up if you don't know what it means. Mm-hmm. Okay. Do you want to just quickly explain in layman's terms?
Not advanced Aaron terms, in very simple Aaron terms.
You
the biggest challenge of
you have 3 sentences.
I'm going to use a lot of semicolons in my sentences. I am Katie. Katie owns a business. We're all following? Perfect. There's market-based accounting. Well, Scope 2 emissions are counted. I know, I'm backtracking. Scope 2 emissions are you can dual report Scope 2 emissions.
That's 3 sentences done.
No. I have... Anyway. I know, this is hard for me. I yap a lot. Okay, there's a dual reporting mandate in the Greenhouse Gas Protocol for Scope 2 emissions, which means that a company can account for their location-based emissions, which is, I am Katie, I own a business in San Diego, I turn on my lights, I get a bill from San Diego Power, who's here. Thank you. SDG&E, thank you guys. And they say the kilowatts you have produced are. I then ask them, what's my customer-specific emission factor? And they say, this is what it is for the power you have consumed. You multiply that number times the kilowatts you've consumed. Ta-da, that's your location-based emission factor. Market-based, this is where it gets spicy, allows you to purchase contractual instruments for that number of consumed power and then supplant the emission factor with those purchased RECs in the United States. They're renewable energy certificates. If you go to the UK, they're GOs or REGOs. But the certificate stays. The certificate is for 1 megawatt hour, and it has a subscribed emission factor. We're still following? That emission factor usually is 0. This is also where it's controversial. I'm just flagging all of the points that Guy's about to bring up. So it is 0. So then you are saying, I have purchased RECs equivalent to the 100 megawatt hours that Katie just consumed. She has purchased 100 megawatt hours of RECs. Now, instead of the emission factor that SDG&E gave her, she is then reporting under market-based accounting 100 RECs of 0 emissions times her consumption of 100 megawatt hours equals, ready, 0. That number is not the same as the several hundreds, potentially thousands, of metric tons of CO2e that she would report under location-based. People are nodding, they're following.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, not 3, but...
Very well done.
Very
Thank
well
you.
done.
Thank you. And so the two numbers are vastly different. And many companies, in fact, I was just trying to get them up on my phone, but the thing's not working. before this panel, I got my team to run the modeling on over 8,000 companies that MSCI tracks for scope 1, 2, and 3. 25%, so over 8,000 of the world's largest companies. 25% of them report scope, both location and market-based. 7% report just location and 5% just report market-based. So there's a significant proportion offer both, and then it's up to the user of that information to interpret it how they want. Inevitably, the location-based numbers are much higher than the market-based. So that's why a lot of companies prefer to promote the market-based ones. And that's extremely prevalent in the tech industry. If we were to move from market-based to location-based, the number of companies in compliance with their targets, currently 25% of SBTI companies are going to fail their targets, their interim targets. That would increase to 50% if we move from market-based to location-based. The tech companies, Microsoft emissions would increase by 2,000, I think it's Microsoft, would increase by 2,000%, and Amazon would increase by 11,000%. Because of the zero rating of the power that they are attributing to the purchase of the RECs or the contracts through their market-based contracts. So through we can debate the philosophy of it, but the raw numbers, just for full disclosure, would push a significant number of companies way off track because of the change of emissions factors. So, we can discuss whether that's a good, whether that is like now moving from fiction to reality, or whether that's perfection being enemy of the good. And what will the companies do? Will they walk away? If they were forced to do this through the revision of the protocol, would they go, crikey, we need to find other ways to reduce our emissions? Can I get another $100 million, whatever it is, to sort of invest in really serious technologies to reduce emissions? Will they walk away from their climate commitments or find some other workaround? That I don't know the answer to, but just to be the messenger of the effect that this would have on the emissions profiles of those companies. And as I mentioned to start with, that will have consequences for the allocation of capital in financial markets, which are prioritizing, which a significant volume of capital priorities sort of low carbon businesses. So yes, I don't know whether that's a good scene setter. I have a personal opinion about whether we should do location or market based, but maybe I should keep that to myself.
Don't keep it to yourself.
I find the use of market based disingenuous. I think if you look at the way in which the supply side of the industry, all of the power stations, both fossil and renewable energy, combine on a system, those numbers should match up completely with the consumer profiles of the reported emissions for that electricity consumption. If you cherry pick through the virtual PPAs, the clean energy plants that are then zero rated under scope 2, you then have to increase the residual coefficients for all the other consumers of that electricity that aren't buying those virtual PPAs. Now that works if every consumer is a business that has to report its scope 2. So say we're the only businesses buying the power on the system, and you buy a REC, and I buy REC, but you two don't. I'm sorry, we're first in the queue. You have to take the dirty stuff. Or you have to report the dirty stuff if we're the only businesses in the system. Now, the reason why the system has a problem is that a lot of residential consumers don't have to report. So even if the suppliers are correctly allocating or attributing the power to the businesses that have signed those types of contracts, the residential consumers that don't have to report this are getting lumped with all the dirty stuff. And so you're really just sort of shuffling stuff around. Now, the reason that the system could work, if there's enough demand for all of the low carbon power, that we start competing for it and we start paying more for it. You want to buy the market-based sort of contract that says low carbon energy source, I want to buy it, we all want to buy it, we'll start bidding up the price. And if that now starts to build new capacity, then we're in business. The question is, how far do you have to go for that to happen? So there is a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow of market-based, but you have to keep trudging through, mopping up all of the demand for this low carbon, this zero carbon sort of power before you get there, and where the increase in price starts to incentivize additional build. So that's my personal opinion. I think Aaron, what you mentioned about the way in which the location-based one, time of day, and accurate reporting of the actual sort of carbon emissions that are used to power, sort of push the electrons down the wire to my facilities is the ideal solution. But that's my personal opinion.
I have so many. But my job as moderator is to keep this going. And what I'm going to do, actually, again, last session of the day, and I want, Aaron, just quick response to what Guy just said, and feel free, your personal or wearing the upper hat, just quick, and then I do want Chris a response. This is a good, heavy, important discussion to have, right? Not necessarily any endorsements here or what we're, but I think this is, and then I'm going to go to the crowd and see if you have any reactions or comments or just quick clarifications on this topic. There are other topics we have to cover before we wrap, but I do want, so Aaron, you first, and then Chris, quick, and then we'll go to the crowd quickly.
Okay, so I think that just actually means talk faster, right? It doesn't mean say less. I think that there are a few key pieces here that are really important. First, what was said earlier, there's a difference between accounting and reporting, right? What AMI is trying to do is categorize how people report emissions. What I'm interested in is what is in those emissions. Those are not the same thing, right? And so some of the paradigms that are coming out are kind of conflating those two things, which is not true. So there's a difference between disclosure or reporting and accounting. And I think that the other piece that Guy is trying to get at is really important, which he's true in concept, but only in certain systems. So part of what makes the United States so special is that we have regulated and unregulated sections of the electric grid. I know, you want to talk about your utilities right now? That's part of the crux of this challenge or question. So a lot of energy companies will contract these renewables or these carbon-free resources, but that also means a lot of regulated utilities have to go to their public utility commission. They request the opportunity to build certain generation assets because the cost of those assets gets pushed off onto residential customers. Within voluntary reporting for decarbonization goals and Scope 2 accounting, they can't purchase VPPAs or PPAs for those resources. So if you're Katie and you're hanging out at your home on the lovely beach in San Diego, what you're getting delivered is what you pay for as the customer. And then if someone wants that, they have to, generally speaking, purchase it through a green tariff program, which is why those exist, or some other kind of PPA workaround, and we can talk about the special kinds all day. But if you're tracking some of them, it's like what Constellation's trying to do with 3 Mile Island. We have Nevada Energy and Google and Advanced Geothermal. I see nodding because people are tracking these kind of shiny announcements. But those are the things that in order just to solve for these big capacity increases on the system, these large loads, those are the things that are happening, is they're not just purchasing solar that's already been allocated to Katie. And for a company to do that, there was an important term that Guy used called a residual grid mix, which then if a utility were to report an emission factor, or if it shows up on eGrid, they would then have to subtract the contracted renewables from that factor, which then automatically generally makes it dirtier, and then report a customer-specific emission factor. Most of those are not entirely fossil because there are those renewables or other carbon-free resources that were already built for those customers. So yes, the emission factor is dirtier. One of the many challenges with this, which is part of why I have a job, is that it's unclear how much dirtier, and that's challenging. And then the rebuttal to what Guy was saying on the voluntary rec market and why it may not be so productive for integrity and clarity of claims is that between So the REC market was originally intended for compliance with RPS and CES standards. I'm seeing more nodding because those things mean something to you. That's good. Since 2013, the total market for RECs has tripled. But for perspective on that number, from 2013 to 2023, we actually saw the voluntary purchases go up like 6x. And the compliance purchases stayed relatively the same because about the same number of states had certain targets, and the targets have not changed. But we're seeing the voluntary market move that. So the question is, what is the impact of that investment? And I think that is where it is challenging, is it's hard to prove that those renewables, where they were built, the impact of that on the system, and yada, yada, yada. But there is something to say for the fact that that number has dramatically changed. And not only because of the regulated market, but because of this voluntary market that was created as a response to market-based accounting.
I take it back. We have less than 15 minutes left.
Sorry.
And we don't only, okay, but I mean, like, we could stay here for another 2 hours, but be quick. Be quick, but I want you to bring it to scope 3. I want you to bring it, I want you to touch on the 200s.
Okay.
Okay. And like, because we've been talking about RECs, yeah, power, it's important what's decided there, but like also the broader accounting, reporting, disclosure, it's important.
Yeah, I just wanted, because Aaron gave me such a nice setup with that last question. You know, what is the impact of that investment?
Yeah.
I think is really the important question. So I just want to try to connect a couple dots, and I don't think I can string this together as cleanly as the two of you just did. But I said at the top that the theory of change behind the current guidance is really this sort of notion of corporate accountability and changing things in your inventory. So when you heard Guy's description, I think, in my view, first off, a lot of the debate about this accounting and in particular grows out of Scope 2, because Scope 2 is in some ways, the most complex of where these things play out. And as Aaron said, it's also the place where we've been grappling with this stuff the longest because of the guidance that GHGB created some 12 years ago now, and the location and market-based structure that they created. The real question I think you have to ask is, are we upset and are we discounting this because we think there's no impact of what's happening, or because we don't like the claims that are being made by the companies? I think if you don't like the claims, Guy's right. Like, the problem is when companies make the investments under the scenarios that he described and then tell the world that they are operating on renewable energy. That's what people don't like, because there's this disconnect in your head. Something doesn't feel right, because you know they're operating their businesses in San Diego, but they bought those RECs from Texas or wherever they bought them. And to accept that is a okay thing and that you buy the claim that the company is making, you kind of have to get your head into this whole system and what they're doing, and nobody wants to do that, and so the whole thing looks dubious. So as a claims framework, I think there's a lot of problems with it. But to go back to Aaron's question at the end about what do you think about the impact, and we may, I don't know if we may disagree on all this, but like, there's 250 or maybe more gigawatts of renewable energy that have been built in the last decade in North America that have been funded by corporates through corporate procurement programs. Now, you can have a conversation about whether the market conditions are so great for renewable energy that would have been built anyway. I will argue till the day is done that they would not have been. They exist because corporations funded that through VPPA structures. They funded that in part, and this is something that I think is really underappreciated, is that the reason in part that it works is companies were buying energy anyway. We finally managed to get a decarbonization goal into a corporate procurement process that corporations were doing anyway. And so they simply had to embed or integrate the renewable energy pieces into their energy purchases as they were planning for capital investment. And that enabled, that coupled with the market-based method, enabled companies to steer that towards new build-out. I don't think I think that impact is hard to argue at. I agree and I understand that once you then make a claim about the impacts of that and how it relates to your operations, now we're into murky territory. But capital and finance don't build renewables. Offtake builds renewables. And corporations stepped up and created offtake that lowered the risk for development, that widely expanded the field for what could get built and how fast it could get built. And we saw unprecedented deployment of renewable energy. Now, why wouldn't we want to repeat that in the other sectors and apply that same sort of fundamental thinking and leverage that mechanism for other aspects of decarbonization?
I just want to build on that, because I think we're in violent agreement.
Rats, I thought we were going to argue about that.
No, I actually think there's, if you're talking about RECs or renewable energy sort of contracts, we're using a single term to reply actually to sort of refer to multiple things. And there are different types, there are different flavors, there's different sorts. And I spent a number of years in a renewable, one of the world's largest renewable energy developers, designing and building PPA contracts and doing the finances and everything else, right? And there is a significant difference between a corporate building and procuring a long-term offtake through a PPA and just buying a REC on the market, on the spot market. The financial structures that you require to build those two, the cost of building a renewable energy project without a PPA is vastly, and relying on merchant operations to just sell your power and your REGOs or RECs into the market on the spot basis is very different to the cost of building a plant where you have a guaranteed off-taker who's going to pay you whatever you need to pay down your debt for 15 years. So if a company is willing to sign up to procure 15 years worth or 20 years worth of power from a renewable energy plant, I would say fill your boots. Go and do that. I think that is additional, I think it is genuine, and I think they should be allowed to report that. I think it's different where somebody else has built the plant and the financial sort of case has been made without that spot. Now then when it starts to get murky is, well, if the spot market starts to increase and that now starts to provide a genuine financial incentive, and I start to use that in my investment appraisal process and get that signed off by the investment committee and the funders and the banks, the question is that bankable? Because a lot of these renewable energy projects require debt, and you can only get the debt if you have a long-term offtake. And if corporate, that could be a utility, or it could be a corporate. And if the corporate wants to do it, fantastic. Trouble is, yes, the numbers, what was it? The number of gigawatts?
225 gigawatts.
Under corporate PPAs. Long-term offtakes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's pretty impressive.
It's a lot of power.
It's a lot of power. In Europe, we can't find businesses that survive that long who are willing to sign up to 15-year commitment to buy power. So I think there's shades of grey in between the spot market and the long-term offtake market. So just, to add to the complexity of the problem we're trying to juggle here.
Wow.
Are those long-term?
This didn't go exactly as I knew it was going to be good. But this has gone by in a flash, and I completely lied about opening to the crowd and so we have 5 minutes left, and I do want to hear from questions. Just throw them out. It doesn't have to be scope 2, although we spend a lot of time. And introduce yourself, and then go for it.
Okay, my name is Juliana, and I am a project developer in Brazil. So in my country, land use is the biggest bucket of emissions, right? And we got scope 3 over here, we got quasi-government, which is predicated on biofuels, and you didn't say anything about the land sector GHG protocol. Right?
Yeah, exactly. That's what I mean. There were things, there were angles we were going to go. Who wants to take that one? They certainly have a lot to say.
What is there to say? I think what you're getting, so GHGP has kind of fragmented some of its guidance, gone kind of sector specific in some key places where there is such uniqueness to the sectors that they have felt like they need to go into to provide sort of supplementary tools to the greenhouse gas protocol. The land sector guidance has been under review and development for 5 years, I think. It includes both the accounting for interventions on agricultural lands, also the same for forestry lands. And so think about both the impacts to the land base of those activities, also the way that you would measure mitigation activities that happen on those. Also think about the fact that both of those land bases naturally remove and store carbon. And so the ways and the rate at which that happens has to be part of the formula for calculating the carbon cycle. We have been arguing for 5 years about how to do that across different sectors. The LSR guidance finally came out last month. And I think to the surprise of most people, even those who were closely involved in it, they basically took the entire forestry chapter out. So we have a body of land sector guidance, which now guides companies in the agriculture, largely think consumer products type companies, to think about how to balance that carbon flux between your activities and your land base. But the forestry sector is basically left without, and so creates a lot of uncertainty and a lot of really challenging scenarios, particularly just given the huge percentage of the land base and that's covered by those corporates. So that's where we are. I've heard mixed things on the ag sector. That sounds like a lot of positive things from the ag sector voices, some concerns, but obviously a lot of disgruntlement from the forestry sector.
I can also add in kind of this concept of what we're talking about. So of course there's the land sector removal standard. There's also the concept of using, if you own that land, right, are you using it, and where does to generate an offset or some other kind of credit, or are others investing in that land? How does that show up? Is it an offset credit? Is it an inset credit? So is it within their supply shed? And so there's also this kind of system currently, which is part of what AMI is trying to solve for, is an offset shows up as a memo item, so you don't net within your emissions inventory. So if you purchase them, they don't actually decrease your scope 1 emissions. They are just kind of a nice piece of paper that you write on the side of your inventory that like you purchased blank credits from blah, 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 that were an investment in blah, blah, blah land project in blah, blah, blah place. So that is also the current structure, and whether that is right or wrong is currently actively debated, and there are proposals on the table for how to, pun intended, I guess, now mitigate for that. But it does add an additional level of uncertainty to, like, if you are a company that is a large landholder, how do you handle that? If you are purchasing or investing within your supply chain or supply shed, where do those kinds of credits or intervention mechanisms show up? The jury's still out is the summary.
Good question. Anybody else? Yeah.
Thank you for this. If you could share your perspectives on carbon measures approach, what problems it solves and what are its limitations?
Can I say no?
You're allowed to say no.
We'll take that offline. We don't have an hour and a half.
Maybe just to, for those of you who are not familiar with carbon measures, a new initiative and focused on product level carbon intensity standards. And they are growing. They have at least 20 corporates as members now, industry, financial, and yeah, are quite active. And I think, so anything to say about carbon measures?
I don't have anything to say about carbon
That's
measures.
allowed.
It's a hard topic to take on in a short period of time. It's a very different way of coming at the questions we've talked about today, which I think attacks some very clear vulnerabilities in the current framework, but also has some enormously complex data dependencies. Doing what they're proposing to do just requires a level of clarity about the data in your supply chain that generally doesn't exist right now. But it's going to be very tricky to see how these systems kind of come together and evolve together in the next couple of years.
Jeremy, introduce yourself.
Hi, Jeremy Rubin from IETA. Sort of building off that a little bit. I mean, we focused on AMI and Scope 2 today. Also thinking about ISO, of course, that harmonization process is happening as part of COP30, codified now. You have carbon measures. If you have a magic wand, 1 to 5 years from now, what do you want to see? What does harmonization look like? What is this world of carbon accounting down the line from your perspective? What do you want to see?
That wasn't even planted as our final question.
Well, Chris, for your opening remarks on the consequential sort of type accounting stuff, I would actually make a plea for simplification. I can see the intellectual attraction of the consequential sort of approach, but as you were explaining it, I'm thinking this is fiendishly complicated, and we're having to create definitions and structures and methodologies, and I have a fear that complexity could come back to bite us. And I know we're trying to attack the same problem from multiple directions. At the end of the day, you burn fossil fuel, emissions go into the atmosphere. It comes out of coal-fired power stations, automobiles, factories, homes. There's a few sources, as I'm simplifying. And we're trying to say who's responsible for that. Is it the facility? Is it the country? Is it the buyer of the product? Is it the extended supply chain? If we try and reduce it, who gains the benefit of it? And it all starts to sort of get incredibly complicated. So I would make a plea for not overcomplicating things and having too many lines of attack, because if they don't join up, we end up getting in a right bugger's muddle. And and I think
It's the ISO GHG, and maybe that's a question for Chris. So ISO, and I'm glad, ISO greenhouse gas protocol partnership, is that a positive?
So try and keep things simple as much as possible.
Oh, I thought I had more time.
Oh,
Sorry.
I'll take it if you want. It's a great question. I think I'd build on. I think Guy's right. I mean, simplicity is critical. I also go back to where I started, which I think, to try to put a finer point on it, would be we are trying to pack onto the physical scope 1, 2, and 3 inventory that Aaron described at the start. We're trying to make it do all these different things, right? It's a reflection of the negatives that you as a company are doing to the world on climate. It is also the place where we are supposed to measure and see all the mitigation actions that you take. And we're supposed to use very complicated accounting processes to establish that relationship. And we really need to pull those things apart. And so what I would like to see is a system that, uses the scope 1, 2, and 3 inventory for what it's intended to do, which is ensure corporate accountability, but also recognizes that what we want is to maximize investments that will have the biggest impact on climate as possible, as fast as we possibly can. And we cannot do that while driving everything into the inventory. So we need a credible accounting system that lives next to the inventory but incentivizes companies to go seek the biggest bang for their buck on what they want to invest in. And that's not by driving everything into your inventory. So we just need a credible accounting system that does that and doesn't try to build it into the existing system.
And I generally agree with those sentiments in that direction of travel. I will say that my only thing I think to add that they haven't brought up is everyone needs to get on board, right? And I think that that's kind of a reflection of what we saw with carbon measures. It's the reflection of what we're seeing with all of the different reporting standards. That's how this gets complicated. And at least to me, if I were to have a magic wand, it would be that everyone agrees on a direction of travel and we commit to that, because that's where integrity comes from. That's where this harmonization comes from, is we all say this is how you calculate the ledger. But then we can all disagree on how we get there. Every company, every individual will get there differently depending on what sector they're in, what country they're in, and what economy they're living in. And the idea is that not everyone does that the same way. But the principles and methodologies of the accounting of that first ledger need to all be the same. And at EPRI, I think I have the privilege of saying I'm technology agnostic. I'm system agnostic. But I care about accuracy, I care about integrity, and I care about transparency. And if we all are doing this, prop up this system because we think this system aligns best with our corporate interest, that is not how we get to harmonization and quantifiable climate action. That is how we get to infighting and everyone getting accused of greenwashing and a lack of credibility in our system. So that's my fairy moment, is I'd like us all to align, get on the same train, and start moving forward.
All right. Got that? So, Jeremy, plug IETA. We obviously have been tracking carbon accounting for many, many, many moons and different permutations and at different levels and engaging with government. Only a couple of months ago did we actually launch a home at IETA for our task force on carbon accounting. Jeremy, how many people are members, individuals across our member companies are on it now?
Individuals, it's a couple hundred, 300-400 at least.
Yeah. Only a couple of weeks ago, or a couple months ago, and around 400 people. So there is a lot of interest. There's a lot of education still to do, right, across the spot. So I guess that is a call to all of you, and you're probably quite influential messengers in your own orbits, right, to make sure at least we can try, as Aaron says, at least be on the same page and have a similar direction of travel, because keep in mind also, it's governments are starting to bake it into their own regulations, legislation, and so I think it's really important. This isn't necessarily just like a voluntary give or take. This also is becoming baked into some of the fabric of like government's regulation globally. But like I said, this thing flew by. And I really appreciate, obviously, these great panelists. So thank you very much to Guy, Chris, and Aaron. And enjoy your evenings. Grab a cocktail, a mocktail, and talk about carbon accounting with your new friends.